outer solar system planets with Jupiter. So now what we want to do is talk about Saturn. Saturn and Jupiter probably both form in a similar fashion. We talked about that, how the solar system formed. So they probably form in a similar fashion out of the proplet, direct condensation rather than just the core accretion that the other planets do. Saturn's been one of the least studied of the planets we've talked about so far. It's easy to see from Earth, so we've seen it a lot from Earth. Telescopically we've studied it. But as far as spacecraft visiting, we've had lots of spacecraft that have been to Venus. We've had a lot of spacecraft that have been to Mars. A whole lot of spacecraft have been to Mars. A whole lot of spacecraft have been to Mercury. Quite a number of spacecraft have been to Jupiter. And granted, a lot of the ones going to Jupiter just went on past, but still a number went to Jupiter and studied it as it was going by. Mercury's not been very well studied because Mercury's hard to get to, but still a couple of spacecraft have been to Mercury. By the time we get to Saturn, such a major planet, we'd expect a host of spacecraft to have been there. But we find that's not really the case. We have the test vehicle, which was Pioneer 11, which tested the whole idea of doing a slingshot to Saturn. And then we had Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 went by Saturn. More recently, and again, those were all 1979 to 1981. More recently, this century, we've had the Cassini spacecraft. And the Cassini spacecraft was sent to Saturn in 2004. And then in 2017, at the end of its life, it was deliberately sacrificed, plunging into Saturn. Now, this was the fate of the Galileo spacecraft at the end of its mission around Jupiter. It deliberately deorbited and crashed into Jupiter. That will be the fate of the Juno spacecraft at Jupiter. Cassini likewise. The reason for this is that these spacecraft, when they're manufactured, it's possible that they could have Earth organisms living on them. These spacecraft were not really designed to land anywhere, but NASA began to think the possibility is that in the distant future they might accidentally crash into one of the moons. Now, some of these moons we've come to realize are potential for holding life, and so potentially habitable. And so we don't want to contaminate them. The spacecraft that are landing on Mars undergo a rigorous decontamination procedure before they're sent there, with the intent to limit any kind of contamination of that planet. The idea being that if we deorbit these spacecraft into the planet, they burn up, and that kills any sort of thing that might be living on them. Cassini spacecraft, again, Titan rocket, 2 side rockets, and then Centaur upper stage, big antenna to send signals back to Earth, but also a lander. It actually had a lander, kind of like the idea that we had with the atmospheric probe of Jupiter. Was launched in 1997. The asteroid belt, dive back towards Venus. Venus's gravity tosses it back towards Earth. Earth's gravity, well, actually, I guess it first of all launched towards Venus, which tossed it back towards Earth, which tossed it to the asteroid belt, dive back in towards Venus. Venus tossed it back towards Earth. Earth tossed it on to Jupiter. And so 3 years or so after launch, it passed by Jupiter, and then continued on its way, and 2004 arrived. So that's, from 1997 of launch to 2004 arrival. So that is almost 7 years transit just to get there. As all the other spacecraft to the outer solar system, other than the Juno spacecraft, had RTGs, radiothermal generators to provide electricity, had cameras, detectors, spectrometers, antennas to point back towards Earth, magnetometer. Titan is one of the moons of Saturn, which has an atmosphere similar to Earth's atmosphere, so we thought it may be potentially habitable. And so the Titan probe was designed to study that moon. It'd be the first moon of another planet landed on. So here's an animation of the Cassini, and it studied the atmosphere and weather patterns, magnetosphere, and the satellites. Special study of the rings of Saturn and of the moon Titan. There are plenty of other moons besides Titan, and I found some interesting things about the other moons that we had no idea about. But this was the basic configuration. Right. The most obvious thing about Saturn is its rings. And so that'll be our next topic of study, is the rings of Saturn.